Hello and welcome back to Saturday Night Light. I hope you're having a great day. I'm here with Michael today. He's on our Camp Sunshine team and he's a dear friend of mine. And today we're going to continue our series Soundtracks, talking about the chatterboxes, the battle in our minds, the storms that come our way, stories in our life, challenges we walk through, and how do we get through that? Not only just practical advice that the world tells us, but also using wisdom from God and His Word. How do we get through those things? And to start, I have to be honest. About something. The other day in our all-staff meeting, because Maryland is getting a little cold here, and I talked about, because we have staff that are not from Maryland, I have people from Florida and other states that don't really face these cold days. I thought it'd be helpful to share practical advice and how do you deal with the shorter days, the dark nights, the cold weather, the snow, because seasonal depression is a big thing in Maryland, and our energy and all that stuff. And so I was just sharing some advice, like you can get the sunlight things for your office, or I know the big ones are like get outside, when the sun is shining, like stand in the sun and just soak it in, or be active, hang out with friends, and do stuff like that. Don't just sit inside and all that stuff. And so what happened was, that we talked about that, and I thought it was great. And then that weekend, it was cold. Because it's cold right now. And so I didn't do anything. I stayed inside. Didn't do anything. And then that Monday, I didn't want to get out of bed. I was like, oh man, I'm depressed. I'm tired. Like, it's cold outside. I don't want to do anything. And I was just laughing at myself because I was just in my frustration of, I just talked about all these helpful things that I know would help me, and yet I didn't do any of them. And I was laughing about it, but then I thought, about the series, we're talking about, and realized that I think sometimes that's how we treat God. I think our relationship with God, sometimes for us that claim that we are Christians and know God's Word, we know that He has tools for us in His Word, that, through the Bible, He gives us those practical advice on how to go through our lives from a spiritual and faith standpoint, and yet we don't listen, and yet we don't act, because we'd rather sit in our stubbornness, we'd rather sit and be the victim, and just, act as God's a genie and say, God, why, just do this for me, thanks. When He said, no, I've given you wisdom, Josiah, you can, get a diffuser that has the peppermint, scent in your office, because it'll help you stay focused. He's given us wisdom and faith. But today we want to just continue that conversation about soundtracks, the battlefield in our mind. How do we grab hold of those thoughts and take control when challenges come? Because they come whether we want them to or not. And I think we need to get practical with what do we do? So I'm here with Michael, and Michael, what are some things in your life, maybe if you have a story or some challenges that you could share with us? Just because I think we all have stories, right? And they're all good to hear because we've walked through different stuff, and I think you can always learn from somebody else. And so, Michael, what's something you've gone through? Maybe you could share a story, and how did you get through that? Or maybe how did you, as we're talking about soundtracks, how did you kind of grab hold of those thoughts, or how did you rely on God through those challenges?
Yeah, so story that comes to my mind is a few years ago, back in ancient history, I went to college. So I started off at community college, got the credits that I needed, and then I transferred to a four-year institution. I went to UMBC, Go Bay Retrievers, great school and everything. But that was kind of my first time living away from home. And so it had been a while, so this was my senior year, technically my second year at UMBC. And so I was figuring things out. I had a couple of my friends, but I was always looking to venture out and keep myself busy in all these things. So my senior year, I was a full-time student, but I was involved in all these extracurricular activities. I was in a couple of clubs, musical theater club, and then another performance kind of music club that performed at our spring festival and things of that nature. And so I was keeping myself busy, had all these classes, trying to make sure I was making and continuing my friendships, but I was finding that I was overbooking myself, overworking myself, and it was weighing on me heavily. And I didn't necessarily recognize it at the time, but then there was another student group that asked me to be a part of their show. And I was kind of reluctant about this. I already had these 3 commitments, school and the other 2 clubs, but they're like, hey, we really want you, we really would like your talent here. And so I agreed upon that. And then I found towards the end of the semester, it was really weighing on me. I was really tired. I was getting behind on all my work. And that was just one factor. And then it was at that point, for whatever reason, it was maybe the stress or things of that nature. I was thinking about my life at home, back at home, and I kind of felt disconnected with my family. My youngest brother, he was like growing up, and I wasn't really like seeing him grow up, wasn't a part of that process. And then my grandpa, he was having these health issues that I knew a little bit about, but there was more information coming back to me of what my family was going on through my family back at home. And so all these things are kind of weighing on me. And it came to this point towards, it was, I think, a day before my birthday. I was hanging out with my friends. I was going to see my family the next day. But I had all these things in my mind that I wasn't communicating to anyone about. I wasn't talking to anyone about it, whether in the organizations I was a part of, to my family, my friends. And it just got to the point where after I hung out with my friends and I went back to the apartment I was staying in, that I was just feeling miserable. I was feeling sad. I was feeling down. I was feeling depressed. I just felt this pain inside of me, and I didn't know what to do with it. There was just all these things going on in my mind. I was feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and I was just crying just on my floor late at night and just crying out to God like, I'm really hurt right now, and I don't know why. But after that point, it was in that moment that I took all this time, but it got to the point where I need to communicate this to someone. So I told the person who was the stage manager for one of our shows about what I was going through. And they were really encouraging, they were helping me, and then they pointed me in the right direction, said, hey, we'll try to ease up on some of these things to give you less responsibility so you can kind of focus on what you need to do. But if I had never gotten to that point, if I had never communicated that to anyone, this would have been this ongoing battle in my head. And it would have been really difficult. So thankfully, through the stage manager, God was helping me in that moment when I was crying out to him. He gave me the people in my life that I needed to talk to, and that helped me through that challenge of that senior year. Graduated okay, did all the shows and everything, and had a good time my senior year. But just when I was at that breaking point, I received the help that I needed from God.
Yeah, that's really good. I think there's lots of helpful things in what Michael just said. But for you, like kind of going off of that, past and story and, how you got through it, how has that shaped like how you kind of handle challenges now? Like what do you do when things come now that you've like, because I think sometimes it's unfortunate, but we don't learn until something happens. And that's when we learn, because it's like, oh gosh, there's tons of, quotes out there, but it's like, we don't learn on our easy days, we learn on hard days, or like, pressure is what produces diamonds. But I think I'm all about like, how do we be preemptive in our lives? Because we know things are coming. The Bible doesn't say like, you're not gonna have any issues. But it does say, how do we navigate them? So I guess like you said, having somebody to go to is like your one practical way of like getting through stuff. Like how do you do that now based on what you learned then?
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the big things is also when you have these thoughts in your head, you're verbalizing it to someone, especially with God. He's a great person that you can verbalize what's going on in your head too. You can kind of hear what's going on, hear what you're feeling. And when you put that in the air, you kind of know what you need, the help that you need. But then aside from that, it's just always communicating to whoever you're working with. You have a good support system at your job. You have a good support system with your friends, your family, just making sure that you're speaking to them, communicating to them when you're going through something. For me, learning from that experience, it's trying to get out in front of things. If you know you're feeling something, if you know you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling stressed, I do a better job of communicating that to the people that I'm around, just so I don't want to be like too prideful and everything, but that's been my issue. But making sure I'm communicating to that, making myself vulnerable, and just letting them know, hey, here's what's going on. And more often than not, my friends, my family, my coworkers, they'll have helpful things that they can help me with, advice that they can give me, easing up my load and things of that nature. Just for me, it's just been making sure that I'm speaking to the people, and I receive lots of good help from the people that I'm around.
Yeah, it reminds me of during the summer, we have like a saying like at camp, and it's like, it's don't be a hero. And it's like, because we all want to be heroes in our lives, right? We all want to like, be amazing, but there's times, especially even in camp, that maybe you can relate to, where there seems to be like a lot going on, and we like feel good about ourselves when we're like, oh, I can get through this stuff, and I don't need help, I don't need to ask for help. But it's what's really happening is you're just, tearing yourself apart on the inside. and you're really just insecure and you don't want to share with other people. And then it's also just not helpful because you're not communicating, and then people have expectations of you that are not true. But it reminds me too of just in the Bible, there's so many different ways and places that God talks about, how do we work with this battlefield on our mind? How do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with challenges? But the one that I thought about as we prayed before this message today is in Philippians. And so it's Philippians 4:6-8, and it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And it goes on in verse 8 to say, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." And I think in life, it's very easy for us to not think about those things. I think it's much easier to think about the negativity, the hardships. I thought it was really cool during when COVID was, very heightened and no one could leave their house and all that stuff. I feel like all we heard was bad news after bad news. But John Krasinski, I think that's how from The Office, he did this YouTube thing where it was called Good News. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that doesn't really exist very much, where there's set apart videos, set apart news, where it's only about good news. Because what happens is good news doesn't really sell, bad news does. Because I think a lot of times our lives are run by fear. But even in Philippians, Paul is writing to the Christians in Philippians and mainly to the church because they're struggling with disagreements, mainly two girls. And this is what he's telling them to, hey, as you're struggling relationally here, as you're working through your frustrations, that's a relational thing. It's the same thing applies to us and God. This is what you do. And what happens is we then gain the peace of God. And it doesn't say in there that, God's going to, solve everything right when we want it. He's not a genie, right? But what he's saying is he's going to guard our hearts. And so what that means is when he's guarding our hearts, we now can go through a lot. Because he's guarding our minds, he's guarding our hearts. And as we talk about soundtracks and the fears and the doubts, the chatterbox that seems to just take over, like you were saying, Michael, I had so many things, but I didn't know how to get it out. And it's hard to communicate sometimes. And that's where I love in verse 8 where it talks about, this is how you do that. You think these things because, practically, if all we're thinking about is negative things, how do you think our life's going to go? But if we're thinking about, like it says, things that are noble, things that are lovely. It's granted, don't ignore the bad things that are happening, but God's giving us help here in this verse to encourage us that, hey, I have peace for you. I have joy for you. There's security in my name. Come to me. He's there knocking at your door right now. And so as we kind of end this time today, my challenge to you, my question to you, my encouragement is how are you in your life navigating challenges? How in your life are you navigating when those fears, when those doubts, when things come, when, I'm too afraid to communicate, I don't want to ask for help? What are you doing when those things come? As we've been talking about this for a few weeks now, and I feel like we've given some good examples, and we'd love to hear from you. So comment down below, how do you walk through challenges? How do you pray? What do you do? Because I think if, we come together, God's put people in our lives for a reason, like Michael was saying. Let's work together to make this practical, to make this easy, because it's not going to be, but I think together we're stronger. And then, if we rest in the affirmation of God and what His Word says, there's no roof for what can happen. And so let's rest in God's peace today. And I encourage you to read more of Philippians and see, the other things that Paul is saying, because I think it's some really good advice. But also comment down below if you got any advice for what to do in Maryland during winter time to stay sane, to stay warm. I do love snowboarding, so I'll probably do that. But we hope that you have a great rest of your weekend, that you have a great week ahead. We are praying for you. So go and be blessed, walk in peace, and all that God has to offer you.